The SS officer's hand slams on the table at Gestapo headquarters in Marseille. It is 2:17 a.m. on April 1st, 1943. On the wall behind him hangs a wanted poster offering 5 million francs for the capture of a woman the German intelligence network has been hunting for 18 months. They call her the White Mouse because she slips through every trap they set. They know she coordinates Allied escape routes that have smuggled over 1,000 downed airmen out of France. They know she carries funds that finance resistance cells across 6 departments. They know she moves between cities with forged papers that somehow pass every checkpoint inspection. What they do not know is her real name, her actual appearance without disguise, or where she will surface next. The poster shows a composite sketch that does not match any of the 3 cover identities she has used in the past year. At this moment, the woman they are hunting sits in a café 200 meters from Gestapo headquarters, drinking coffee and reading a newspaper. She has just walked past 4 German soldiers who did not look at her twice. In 6 hours, she will board a train to Lyon, carrying 70,000 francs hidden in her undergarments to fund sabotage operations. In 3 weeks, she will escape France, hours ahead of a Gestapo raid that arrests 16 resistance members. In 4 years, she will parachute back into occupied territory, leading a Maquis force that will kill over 1,400 German soldiers in coordinated attacks before D-Day. But the liberation of France will not bring recognition. Instead, the French resistance will systematically minimize her contributions in official histories, downplay her role in escape networks, and attribute her operations to male commanders who worked under her authority. For 40 years, the truth about what she accomplished will remain buried in classified files. Not because France wants to protect operational security, but because acknowledging her would mean admitting that a foreign woman ran networks the French government later claimed were domestically organized resistance movements. The files documenting her operations will remain sealed in New Zealand archives until 1985, when her own government finally releases evidence that proves what Gestapo intelligence had known since 1942, that the most effective Allied operative in southern France was a 30-year-old woman from Wellington who spoke French with an accent and operated with a contempt for security protocols that terrified her colleagues and made her impossible to catch. Her name was Nancy Wake. The Gestapo called her the White Mouse. The French resistance called her invaluable, then spent 4 decades erasing her from the record. This is why Nancy Grace Augusta Wake was born on August 30th, 1912, in Wellington, New Zealand, to a journalist father and a mother who ran a boarding house after the marriage collapsed. The family was poor. Her father, Charles Wake, left when Nancy was 2 years old, and her mother, Ella, struggled to support 6 children on boarding house income. Nancy grew up watching her mother work 16-hour days to keep food on the table, and developed an early contempt for authority figures who she felt looked down on working-class families. At 16, she left school and took work as a nurse, but found the restrictions unbearable and quit after 6 months. She wanted to see the world, wanted excitement that Wellington could not provide. So she saved every penny from odd jobs until she had enough for a one-way ticket to London. She arrived in 1932 with no connections, no job prospects, and a determination to make something happen. She found work as a journalist, writing for Hearst newspapers. Nothing glamorous, society columns and human interest pieces. But it paid enough to survive and gave her access to circles she would never have entered as a nurse from New Zealand. In 1933, Hearst sent her to Paris as a European correspondent, and Nancy fell in love with the city immediately. Paris in the mid-1930s was still recovering from World War I. but had regained its position as cultural capital of Europe. Nancy immersed herself in the expatriate journalist community, learned French, covered fashion shows and society events, and lived the life she had imagined in Wellington. Then in 1935, Hearst sent her to Vienna to cover political developments. What she saw there changed her trajectory completely. Vienna, in 1935, was a city where Nazi influence was growing, despite being officially banned. Nancy witnessed SA brown shirts beating Jewish families in the streets. She saw synagogues vandalized. She interviewed refugees fleeing Germany who described concentration camps and systematic persecution. The experience radicalized her. She returned to Paris with a visceral hatred of fascism and a determination to do something if war came. That opportunity arrived in 1936 when she met Henri, a wealthy French industrialist, 14 years her senior, who owned factories in Marseille. They married in 1939. Henri provided financial security Nancy had never had growing up. They settled in Marseille in a mansion overlooking the Mediterranean, and Nancy could have spent the war in comfort. When Germany invaded France in May 1940, she chose differently. As German forces swept through northern France and the government fled to Bordeaux, Nancy volunteered as an ambulance driver, evacuating wounded soldiers from collapsing front lines. She saw the chaos of military defeat, roads clogged with refugees, German aircraft strafing civilian columns, French units surrendering en masse. By June, France had signed an armistice. Germany occupied the northern two-thirds of the country. The collaborationist Vichy regime controlled the south. Marseille fell under Vichy authority, which meant Nazi policies were enforced through French police. Henri expected they would keep their heads down and survive until the war ended. Nancy could not do that. By late 1940, Nancy was using her social connections to help British soldiers and downed RAF pilots escape from France. Marseille was full of stranded Allied personnel, men who had been cut off during the invasion, evaded capture, and now needed to reach neutral Spain, then Gibraltar, to rejoin their units. Moving them required money, false papers, safe houses, and a network of people willing to risk execution for harboring enemy soldiers. Nancy provided all of it. She used Henri's wealth to fund operations, bribed Vichy officials for documents, housed escapees in their mansion, and personally escorted groups to the Spanish border through mountain passes the Gestapo had not secured. The work was amateurish at first. Nancy had no training in clandestine operations. She made mistakes that should have gotten her caught. But she learned quickly and built a network that became one of the most effective escape lines in southern France. Between 1940 and 1943, her network smuggled over 1,000 Allied personnel out of occupied territory. The scale of operations attracted German attention. The Gestapo noticed a pattern in 1941. Allied soldiers were disappearing from Marseille at rates that suggested organized assistance. They launched investigations, infiltrated networks, arrested dozens of resistors. Nancy evaded every sweep. She used multiple identities, changed appearance constantly, carried forged papers from 3 different regions, and operated with such apparent carelessness that Gestapo officers assumed she was too obvious to be important. She would walk past checkpoints, chatting with German soldiers, attend parties where Vichy officials discussed security operations, hide escaping airmen in her home, while entertaining German officers at dinner parties downstairs. The audacity was her protection. Nobody suspected that a wealthy socialite, who spoke French with a noticeable accent and seemed more interested in fashion than politics, was running an espionage network. By 1942, German intelligence had identified her as a person of interest and assigned her the code name, the White Mouse, for her ability to slip away every time they closed in. The nickname became known to Allied intelligence, and Nancy learned she had a price on her head: 5 million francs. The Gestapo's most wanted person in southern France. The situation became critical in early 1943, when informants compromised parts of her network. Gestapo raids arrested 16 people Nancy had worked with. They were tortured for information about leadership. Several died without revealing her identity. But the Germans now knew the network was directed by a foreign woman, and they intensified surveillance. Henri urged Nancy to flee to Spain while escape was possible. She refused, argued that running would abandon people depending on her, that she could still operate if she stayed ahead of arrests. Henri made the decision for her. In March 1943, he contacted the British consulate in Marseille, which had maintained underground presence through the war, and arranged Nancy's evacuation. She agreed only after Henri promised to follow once he secured their assets. That promise cost him his life. Nancy left Marseille on March 11, 1943, with forged papers identifying her as a Spanish refugee. The route to Spain required crossing the Pyrenees through mountain passes still covered in snow. She traveled with a group of 6 escaping Allied soldiers and 2 resistance guides. The crossing took 4 days in temperatures below freezing, climbing at night to avoid German patrols, hiding in shepherd huts during daylight. One man froze to death. Another twisted his ankle so badly he could not walk and had to be carried. Nancy kept moving, reached Spain, was interned by Spanish authorities, who treated Allied escapees as illegal immigrants, spent 6 weeks negotiating release through British diplomatic channels, and finally reached Gibraltar in May 1943. Britain sent her to London, where military intelligence debriefed her extensively about operations in France. They wanted details on German dispositions, Vichy collaboration, resistance capabilities. Nancy provided comprehensive reports that impressed SOE enough to offer recruitment. She accepted immediately, not out of patriotism to Britain, but out of fury at what she had seen in France and determination to go back. SOE sent her to training facilities in Scotland, where she learned parachute operations, weapons handling, demolitions, silent killing, and clandestine communications. The training staff noted she was physically fearless, but dismissed security protocols as paranoia. She argued that excessive caution made you predictable and that boldness was better operational security than hiding. The instructors disagreed, but could not deny she had survived 18 months running networks in occupied France, so her methods clearly worked. In February 1944, SOE assessed her ready for deployment and assigned her to F Section, Operations in France. Her cover identity was Helene. Her real mission was to coordinate Maquis resistance groups in the Auvergne region ahead of Allied invasion. On the night of April 29, 1944, Nancy Wake parachuted into central France to organize guerrilla warfare behind German lines. The jump went wrong immediately. Nancy landed in a tree, hung 15 feet above ground, tangled in parachute lines, and spent 2 hours cutting herself free before dropping heavily to the forest floor. She twisted her ankle, lost her radio, and spent the first night in France, limping through woods, trying to find the reception committee that was supposed to meet her. She located them at dawn, a group of Maquis fighters who looked at her skeptically because SOE had not informed them their new commander would be a woman. The Maquis were resistance fighters who had taken to rural areas to avoid German labor conscription. They operated independently, resented authority, and did not take orders well, especially from outsiders. Nancy assessed the situation and made a decision that defined her leadership approach. She would not try to command respect through rank or credentials. She would earn it through capability. Over the next month, she transformed a disorganized group of 200 rural fighters into an effective guerrilla force. She used SOE funds to purchase weapons from black market dealers. She organized supply drops, coordinating with RAF to parachute ammunition and explosives. She led raids against German facilities, personally participating in ambushes, rather than directing from safety. The men respected that. Within weeks, Nancy had the loyalty of fighters who had refused to follow male SOE officers. The scale of operations expanded rapidly. By June 1944, Nancy was coordinating a force of 7,000 Maquis across 4 departments. They conducted over 100 sabotage operations in the 2 weeks before D-Day, destroying bridges, cutting rail lines, ambushing German convoys. Nancy personally led a raid on a Gestapo headquarters in Montluçon, organized an attack on a German garrison that killed 38 soldiers, and coordinated the destruction of the Gestapo office in Vichy. The Germans launched counterattacks trying to suppress resistance activity before the invasion. Nancy's forces fought pitched battles against Wehrmacht units, sustaining casualties but inflicting disproportionate losses. On June 11, 1944, a German armored column attacked the Maquis base at Montmouchet. Nancy's fighters held off 1,200 German soldiers for 2 days before withdrawing to avoid encirclement. The battle demonstrated that French resistance was no longer sabotage cells, but organized military forces capable of engaging German units directly. Nancy's most significant contribution came in coordinating intelligence for Allied commanders. She transmitted reports on German troop movements, identified targets for airstrikes, and mapped defensive positions. This information helped Allied forces exploit weaknesses in German lines after D-Day. By August 1944, as Allied forces advanced across France, Nancy's Maquis conducted coordinated attacks that disrupted German retreat and prevented organized resistance. The operations were wildly successful. Estimates suggest Nancy's forces killed over 1,400 German soldiers and destroyed significant military infrastructure. The cost was high. Over 100 Maquis fighters died in combat. Many were captured and executed, but the contribution to liberation was undeniable. When American forces reached the Auvergne region in September 1944, they found areas already secured by resistance forces under Nancy's coordination. The end of the war should have brought recognition. Nancy expected to return to Marseille, reunite with Henri, and rebuild the life the war had disrupted. Instead, she received news that Henri had been arrested by the Gestapo in October 1943, tortured for information about her network, and executed when he refused to cooperate. He had died protecting her identity. Nancy was devastated. She remained in France through late 1944, helping with post-liberation reconstruction, but found herself increasingly marginalized by French authorities. The provisional government was constructing a narrative of French resistance that emphasized domestic opposition to occupation and downplayed Allied assistance. Nancy's operations did not fit that narrative. She was a foreigner, a woman, and someone whose networks had been funded by British intelligence. Acknowledging her role would undermine the story France wanted to tell about resistance being indigenous French patriotism, so officials began minimizing her contributions in reports and attributing her operations to male French commanders. Nancy noticed the erasure immediately. Reports she filed with Allied command were altered to remove her name and credit resistance leaders who had worked under her direction. Operations she had personally led were described as coordinated by French officers. SOE tried to correct the record but met resistance from French authorities who controlled access to archives and official histories. The disagreement created tension between Britain and France over how resistance would be commemorated. France wanted control of the narrative. Britain wanted credit for SOE operations. Nancy became caught between competing national interests. Her actual contributions subordinated to political considerations. She received decorations from multiple countries: the George Medal from Britain, the Medal of Freedom from the United States, the Médaille de la Résistance from France. But the citations were vague about what specifically she had done. The details remained classified. Nancy left France in 1945 and spent the next 4 decades trying to set the record straight. She gave interviews to journalists, wrote letters to military historians, contacted SOE veterans, asking them to corroborate her account. Most refused, citing Official Secrets Act restrictions. Some supported her privately, but would not speak publicly. French archives remained closed to researchers requesting files on her operations. The official history published by the French government in 1947 mentioned her briefly as one of many Allied liaison officers, allocating 3 sentences to operations that had involved 7,000 fighters. Nancy appealed to New Zealand government to release her service records. They refused, stating files were classified for national security reasons. She appealed to British authorities. Same response. She appealed to American military intelligence, which had debriefed her after the war. Files remained sealed. The pattern was clear. Multiple governments had decided that Nancy's story would not be told in full, because telling it complicated preferred narratives about how France was liberated. A breakthrough came in 1985 when a New Zealand journalist researching SOE operations filed Freedom of Information requests with the government. After 2 years of legal pressure, New Zealand released Nancy's service files, revealing the scope of operations she had commanded. The documents showed she had coordinated the largest Maquis network in the Auvergne, led operations that killed 1,400 German soldiers, and been recommended for decorations that were never processed. British files, released shortly after, confirmed her role and included testimony from SOE officers who stated she had been the most effective field commander in central France. French archives remained closed. France did not release full documentation on resistance networks until the late 1990s, and even then, files related to Allied operations were heavily redacted. The reason became apparent when historians accessed unredacted versions through legal challenges. The files showed that French authorities had systematically attributed Allied coordinated operations to French resistance leadership to support the narrative that liberation was primarily a domestic achievement. Nancy's operations were particularly problematic because they had been so visible and so successful that completely erasing them was impossible. So the solution was minimization. Acknowledge she existed but claim her role was advisory rather than command. Nancy lived until 2011, dying in London at 98 years old. By then, her story had been partially rehabilitated through biographies and documentaries, but the full truth remained contested. France never officially acknowledged the extent of her operations. Resistance commemorations did not include her prominently. When memorials were erected to resistance fighters, her name was absent or listed among minor contributors. She gave her final interview in 2003, stating she was not bitter about the lack of recognition, that the work had been its own reward, that she did not need France to acknowledge what she had done, because the people she saved knew the truth. But she also stated that history should be accurate, and that governments that classified truth to protect nationalist narratives were dishonest. The files released in 1985 proved she had been the most wanted Allied operative in France with a 5 million franc bounty, that she had coordinated the largest Maquis force in central France, that her operations killed over 1,400 enemy soldiers, that she led combat operations personally rather than directing from safety, that she survived when dozens of other SOE agents were captured and executed. All of this was documented. All of it was buried for 40 years because acknowledging it required admitting that a foreign woman had done what French resistance mythology claimed was accomplished by French men. The Gestapo knew who she was worth hunting. The British government knew what she accomplished, but classified the evidence. The French government knew her contributions, threatened their preferred story, so they minimized them, and Nancy Wake spent decades fighting bureaucracies that cared more about national reputation than historical accuracy. She won eventually, because documents do not lie, and enough journalists and historians pushed for release. that governments could not maintain classification indefinitely. But 40 years is a long time to wait for truth. 40 years of histories that credited male commanders for operations she led. 40 years of commemorations that excluded her. 40 years of official narratives that erased her, because acknowledging her complicated the story governments wanted to tell. The files that proved everything were released in 1985. Nancy was 73 years old. She had spent most of her adult life fighting, not Germans, but her own governments, for the simple recognition that she had done what the evidence showed she did. That is the legacy of classified files used to protect institutional narratives rather than operational security. That is why the White Mouse spent decades invisible, not because she wanted to disappear, but because governments made her disappear. If this story resonates, if it makes you question how many other files remain sealed to protect national mythology rather than security, there are 3 things you can do. First, like this video. Engagement signals that these stories matter, that declassified documents reveal truths we lose when we accept official narratives without scrutiny. Second, subscribe and enable notifications. We are documenting operations that governments buried, contributions that were erased, agents whose stories remained classified for decades because acknowledging them required admitting uncomfortable facts. More stories are coming. Third, leave a comment. Tell us where you are watching from. Share if you have encountered situations where official histories omitted facts that complicated preferred narratives. Connect with others who understand that the most important stories are often the ones governments work hardest to keep sealed. Nancy Wake was the Gestapo's most wanted operative in France. She commanded 7,000 resistance fighters. She killed 1,400 enemy soldiers. And France buried her story for 40 years because it did not fit the liberation mythology they wanted to construct. The files that prove it were sealed until 1985. The truth took 40 years to emerge from classification. And the woman they called the White Mouse spent her final decades fighting bureaucracies for recognition that should never have been withheld. Thank you for watching. Thank you for engaging with stories governments tried to suppress. Subscribe, enable notifications, and remember that classified files often protect reputation more than security.